I kind of, in my mind anyway, relate planetary governments to like nation countries here on Earth, like Germany or France or whatever. And that way it helps me kind of mentally get over the block of or even paint myself into a corner of, if this civilization is interstellar and there's a planet, let's just say a planet like Earth now somewhere else, with a whole bunch of different countries and a whole bunch of different policies and a whole bunch of different people, like how does that play out on an intergalactic scale, or I'm sorry, interstellar scale? But it that can very easily get really complicated really quickly, and if it doesn't serve the story, then it doesn't matter.
Drop troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Reaction in the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are four veterans who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction, more niche than the Space Force. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series, Jeffery H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series, as well as the Wraith and Arsenal superhero series, Josh Hayes, author of the Valor series, and now what's the newest one that came out that's on Audible that folks should go check out?
Audible exclusive, right?
Navarro's Chronicles.
Navarro's
Well, it's not technically audio exclusive, but it is just in audio right now. It'll be in paperback in probably like 2 weeks.
Oh, nice. And I am James Stiegel, author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars series and the Galactic Law series. Between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written, although most of that is Rick, more than 30 years publishing experience, and on the military side would be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. So join our Discord server to tell us how much you love us. And today we're going to talk about a pretty common sort of criticism, I guess, that gets leveled at military science fiction, which is, in a significantly advanced society, why is there war? Like, if people have figured out how to be intergalactic, if they have figured out laser beams and rocket engines, haven't they surpassed the need to use violence to accomplish their goals? But even then, as I say that, I'm thinking, like, is war always violent? Who knows? That could be a good question point there. So anyway, that's what we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear your thoughts later. But who wants to kick it off? Like, Rick, I think you jumped right to resources and thinking about intergalactic war.
Well, not necessarily intergalactic, but if you got the technology, to go faster than light and get to other star systems, then that almost automatically means that any conventional resource is not worth fighting over, because you can get them anywhere. You can get any mineral you want in the asteroid belt. You can get gases from gas giants. You can pretty much get anything that doesn't require living material from places where nobody's going to fight you for it, which is why it's one of the neglected and underrated parts of writing military science fiction, is coming up with a good reason why anybody has an interstellar war.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we could put little gifts in, because I feel like right now would be the perfect time to have that scene from Star Trek 6 where he's like, "We need breathing room," and Kirk is like, "Earth, Hitler, 1937." Well, that's like, that is the thing that you can't get anywhere, right? Is the habitable planets.
Well, I mean, that we don't know. I mean, and that also depends on what you write. You're the one creating that reality. In our reality, and in the reality, we don't know how many habitable planets there are. And if you can go faster than light, if they're even, one every 200 light years, how fast can your drive go? How fast can you get there? that's all part of why you would or would not fight for habitable planets.
Well, yes, but what I'm saying is that even though you're right about the resources, because you've got asteroid belts and you got moons and other planets, the one thing that would always be a premium would be a habitable planet that could grow food. If there were hundreds of them everywhere, we would have seen one by now. There would be another one in our system. So assuming that they're somewhat rare, maybe not 100% rare, but somewhat rare, they're still going to be desirable enough. Doesn't matter how common they are, they're still going to be desirable.
It's true, but that's not the only place you can grow food, though. I mean, it's very possible to make space habitats that you can grow food in. It's just expensive, but if you have the all those resources to draw from, maybe it's less expensive to build orbital farms than it is to go to war with another,
It's
another
less,
star-frame race.
it's less expensive and more efficient to have nuclear reactors to power our society too.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the big things to think about is like the dumb human reasons that we do things, because it makes a whole lot more sense for an advanced society to live in orbitals away from planets. But is there going to be a reason for them to, admire and adhere to planets or want to stay on planets?
Well, that's the reason. That's the thing about interstellar war. I can only come up with reasons that do not come from logic or just cold equations like resources. The reasons I could come up with for it were religious, philosophical, ethical, things that are not really
I mean, that's the vast
quantifiable.
amount of wars in history.
Well, I mean, you can make a case that a lot of the wars were for control of like
Land.
not just land, but like crossroads, ports, places that are key to trade and wealth.
Internal
To
pressures
resources.
within a country or society as well. Like,
But there are also reasons above those. But you can make a case that down at the bottom of them, they probably wouldn't have gone to war for so long or fought so hard if it hadn't meant survival as a nation. But
I think if you look at the wars of history, like the biggest, deadliest wars had nothing to do with resources. I mean, World War I and World War II didn't have anything to do with resources. Not really. I mean, World War I started because of a mistake, really, and then everybody kind of jumped on board.
Well, it started. That was the spark for it. Was the mistake, but I mean, the rivalries between those blocks of nations certainly involve resources like colonies. And
involved it, but it wasn't about it. I mean, they spoke different languages. They had different religions. It's again. There's very rarely is there one reason for any given war, right? I mean, can you think of a war that had one reason? I mean, there are wars that had one reason for us to be involved in them, but like how they started, I mean, there's usually like a cascade of events having nothing to do really with anything that you would consider logical. I mean, look at the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, or the what was that one more? British War. Scotland was all about just getting taxes. Had nothing to do
and
with
the other thing too is it depends on whether or not your books have aliens or if it's just like human centric or whatever, because aliens are going to have a completely different logic system and like need and thought process than humans, and short from just like an alien invasion where the aliens just want to take over the galaxy or whatever, you can very easily come up with something that the aliens need that isn't necessarily a human need, but also it could be just that how many fights start out because people can't communicate, and the inability to communicate.
Ender's Game, right? Was the first in Ender's Game. The first Bugger War was about their inability to communicate. The buggers thought the humans were just like them, and boy, and that's such a human thing, though, right? Like, how many fights have you had with your spouse because you just didn't understand?
Well, it's like in Star Trek how all the aliens are very what's the word? Homo sapien like or something. What's the
humanoid?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. they're basically all the aliens in Star Trek and even in kind of Star Wars too, or they're humanoid. And I think they're just easier to write that way if you write your aliens that are like that.
Right.
But to make them, the one example that comes to mind for me from books that I've read is Pandora's Star with Morning Light Mountain, the alien in that book. And the alien in that book has absolutely no concept of humanity, doesn't have any idea what a conscience is or what morals are, an ethic, anything like that. Has absolutely no understanding of any of those ideas or concepts. And even in when the humans first encounter this alien, there's no communication at all, but also that you get a perspective from the alien, and they like rip off one of the human's arms, and the human starts screaming, but the alien has no concept that the person is in pain. It doesn't understand the emotion. It doesn't understand it doesn't even really understand the sounds. And having that kind of communication issue is, if you have that, then you don't really need anything else, right? You can just have that.
Yeah, Thomas A. Mays wrote a book called Sword into Darkness, which I thought tackled the whole why fight interstellar wars things imaginatively. And in that one, the aliens are collecting works of art from different cultures, and it's like it having more artwork than the rival. They didn't call them houses, but I can't remember what he did call them. Is like a status symbol. So they will go to war with another society just to steal their works of art.
So for them, it's like a highly stylized. I mean, which almost World War I began in ways like you could say that they, their treaties and they had highly stylized forms of fighting that then turned absolutely terrible. That is one way you could approach it too, cultural, and people think it'll be okay until things turn terribly bad.
Like the Civil War,
Right.
there were people gathered there to
right.
to watch, like it was a theater.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that was pretty common throughout history, though. I
Right.
mean, people. There was this war. It was the last war that was fought with the last battle that was fought with destriers, and there were people watching. There was people on the sidelines basically watching to see how it went, and that's why we know it was the last battle with destriers.
They had money on the French.
Yeah, the Mass Effect handled the non-humanoid aliens really well. I thought, like there were the jellies that just floated in the air. I mean, like, why would you even go to war with them? I mean, you couldn't possibly want the same thing.
Envy. It's envy because they're so jelly.
Yeah.
No,
and they had the. You're going to cut that out in editing, right?
All of Rick's
the elephant things that were really slow, but were considered, like practically indestructible, so nobody fought them. And then you had the machines that were like, yeah, this is just what we do. We're programmed to purge all life from, spoiler alert, all life from the galaxy every 50,000 years to keep it from overrunning the galaxy in the typical anti-human narrative of villains in Hollywood and video games. But you have aliens that are so alien you can't communicate with them, and they can't communicate with you. You're going to end up not really with a reason to have any kind of interaction with them at all.
The problem there is that's not an interesting thing to read.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So you have to consider that. I mean, we're not going to talk about Dune, but that's something that Herbert set up, from the beginning. Like spice, when you think about all the reasons, why wouldn't spice occur in other places? Like what other mineral doesn't occur throughout the galaxy? But no, spice is on this one planet. And we're going to go fight over this planet.
Yeah, there are things that are so rare they might as well only occur in one place. Well, I mean, osmium. If you just look at osmium, osmium is super rare. Even in asteroids that we've detected, it is really rare. So I mean, there could be a planet, but I mean, spice wasn't a mineral, though, was it? Spoiler alert.
Worm juice.
It's the decaying remains of the worms.
Yep.
Yeah, but it was really interesting because he set up that entire galaxy that they had to run off spice, and the spice only came from one place.
I was wondering how they got there in the first place.
So it'd be completely idiotic for someone to show up and be like, "Oh, we're going to destroy you," even though you control the spice production, and if we fail, we're stuck here. I mean, that would just be the dumbest thing ever, to have a fleet show up like at the end of a movie and like threaten the person who has all the spice. That's
one thing Frank Herbert did really well was set up the reason why spice was so key, because the whole Butlerian jihad meant that you couldn't use artificial intelligence to navigate your ships for you. So they had to have somebody who with augmented brains,
Right.
and Spice was the only thing who could do that for him.
But yeah, I mean,
But
so there's lots of reasons to go to war, I think. And I think all the reasons we go to war today are still going to be relevant in the future. I mean, Fallout has that whole thing about war never
War
changes.
never changes.
And it really doesn't. I mean, if you look at 4,000 years ago, why the Assyrians were attacking everybody, they wanted to control everybody, they wanted to control everything. And they really liked torturing and murdering and mutilating people. There's no reason why that
who
would
doesn't?
in the future. Yeah, well, no, I mean, the thing is, there's no reason that wouldn't exist in the future. There's this weird idea that people have that we're somehow more evolved than we were. We're as evolved as the police allow us to be. We're as evolved as our food.
Well, there was
allows us to be.
just an anthropological article that came out. It was something about they'd found some old, like 200,000-year-old human DNA. Or no, that's too old, 20,000 years. But basically that you could clone that person and they would be like, they had a picture of them and they look like, I don't want to bag on people from West Virginia, but it said like they looked Appalachian. But it was just, that was the idea. Like, we have this concept that we're smarter or better, and humans are still going to human. Like if we become half machine, like the Butlerian jihad is concerned about. Like, I guess that
Butlerian Jihad.
the Jutlerian jihad.
I like that.
It always sounds weird to say jihad. I'm a whatever, global war on terrorism baby. But anyway, it's
The Germans won't let me use jihad.
I know.
Hajib in my
Hajib?
book.
Really?
Yeah. So one of my characters calls one of the people from the not Hajib, Haji
Haji?
calls one of the people from the Caliphate Haji.
Uh-huh.
And my books are currently being translated into German, and they're like, you can't use that. And I'm like, well, you're the publisher, so
since when did Haji become when did Haji become a slur? It's what you call somebody who's done the Hajj.
It's also what a lot of soldiers call everybody from the Middle East, Haji.
Yeah. You can say Mohammed. Like, I had a guy that worked for me that would introduce himself as like a joke. He's like, I have the most common name in the world.
Muhammad.
Yeah.
And it Muhammad? Because I've met those.
I wasn't really aware of that until he made the joke about it. But
I used to work in a call center, and my number one call, I kept track of names because I always find names interesting. And the number one call I got would be from Mohammed in New York City. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting. Is that common? And he's like, oh yeah, it's very, very common in the Middle East to have your name be Muhammad.
See, now there's a person that wants to write their name on history, so they've got reasons to. They might be somebody.
Like a Christian being called Jesus.
I know. Well, I mean, prestige, like some other things that the reasons of the ego. Anybody that gets into power and wants to maintain power. But I don't know where I was going with the other thing is that humans, like assuming that humans, even 10,000 years from now will be that much different from us, unless we, social media turns us all into jellyfish. Then, or there will be humans that are jellyfish and other humans that didn't change.
I think society and culture can change, but the basic roles don't change. There will always be someone who wants to control others, whether that's man or woman or a jellyfish doesn't really matter. I mean, there's always going to be people who want to control everybody else.
I'd hate to bring up Peter Hamilton again, but
why he's amazing.
You love it.
Everyone should read
I always just harp on him because he does such great different science fiction settings, and the series that is set, I believe, like 1,000 years after Pandora's Star. I can't remember the timeline exactly, but humans have evolved and advanced so much that there are now specific factions of different kinds of humans, and that the one that I can remember specifically is the post-human society, where they've post-physical society, where they've kind of uploaded themselves into a digital space and they aren't actually physical anymore. And I mean, this kind of falls into like maybe an ethical or even a doctrinal belief of like, that's not human. And so you're going to have people that are totally against that. And you're going to have people that are, that's going to create conflict and wars and just like nowadays where people are fighting over their beliefs
But just
and
look at
whether
like the rise of AI or
for
Musk's
sure.
Ethernet port
Neuralink.
he wants to install
Yeah.
on people. There's already people drawing lines in the sand there too. So it makes total sense.
Yeah.
He wrote one of my favorite sci-fi noir books of all time. It's called Mind Star Rising. If you've never read it, you should. It's really, really good. It's a sci-fi thriller.
I think I've read the whole series. I went on a Peter Hamilton binge a long time ago, and it is a good series. I don't think it's his best because it was his first.
Wait, was his
And
first?
Mindstar Rising was his first
Oh, I
novel.
thought the
Yeah.
other series was his first. No, I am. I read
Reality
the first
Dysfunction?
two. Yeah, I read the first two, Mindstar, and the one that came after it. I didn't really care for the one that came after it, but the first one, Mindstar, was just.
Yeah, it was really good. His best work, I think, is Pandora's Star and Judas Unchained, but like the Reality Dysfunction is really good, but that trilogy is super long. It's like 1.5 million words or something as a trilogy.
That's why it came out of 6 books in the United States at first.
Exactly right. Yeah. But man, he just does like really different, weird stuff that you wouldn't normally that not that you wouldn't normally write about, but that it's not easy to write about because it takes a lot of effort to really kind of ponder your way through not just the cool factor, but how does that affect humanity and what they do and how they live their daily lives.
That's what you get to do when you write a best-selling trad pub book. You get to do whatever the hell you want after that.
That's true.
Back in the day, I don't know if that's the case anymore.
Well, I mean, you look at Brandon Sanderson; he writes in every single genre possible, and it's not really possible for the average writer. I mean, it's possible for the successful ones, like the ones getting millions of dollars in advances, but it's not possible for us. Like if you wanted to, well, it is possible, but you're gonna have significant roadblocks. I know Rick at some point wants to write epic fantasy, and he's just gonna have to approach that 100 times more carefully than someone who had never published a book before.
Well, I don't have time for it. It's the biggest problem.
That's a whole other topic we could get into.
Yeah.
Yeah, cross genre. Don't do it.
I think the question here is if you are doing as Josh was talking about a universe with just humans in it, it's a lot easier to come up with reasons for war than if you were doing it, or if you're doing it with humanoid aliens that are kind of like us. But if you're doing it with truly alien aliens, then the reasons for war become even harder to come up with.
Yeah, I mean that was part of the reason why I wanted to focus just on the humans in Grimm's War and not add aliens. So I did add tiny, like a hint of aliens in the book. But so alien that you would never know or be able to communicate with them in any way. I think it's in book 3.
Well, I think that's where you get into what does war mean then? Like, like what are their goals? What are their means of, like, what is their time scale? Like, that's one thing I think about quite often, like the way the Chinese and Belt and Road and what they might, like what one culture might consider a war, but it's got a time scale of 100 years versus a time scale of like, you've got 4 years to get this done. And
China
20.
Or 20.
China doesn't have 100 years to get anything done.
Well,
China doesn't have 10 years to get anything done.
In their minds, they do though. The party thinks they do, so they plan that way.
Actually, one could argue that the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the reasons they don't have 100 years because they've been wasting too much money on things when they should have been beefing up their own infrastructure.
That kind of goes to what we were talking about the last episode with enemies or whatever, but like the motivations, like if your society is developed in a certain way, say it like China, right? And now you've got to struggle for whatever it is, resources or food or whatever, because you've dumped all of your resources into option A, but you really need option B too. I can't remember exactly what it was. And you guys will probably be able to help me out here, but the first like 8 Honor Harrington books are really, really closely plotted around the conflict with the Havenites. And the short Victorious War kind of kicked off that big arc. And the way that I remember it being is that the way that the Havenite society was set up, because they were kind of socialist and they lived on the dole and that kind of stuff. They had to continually expand to broaden their income base by taking over and annexing planets and bringing their GDP into their larger financial operations. And that, I mean, that it seemed like we were just talking about resources. You think about that and you're like, how much do they actually need? But on a galactic scale,
It wouldn't work, because every time you do that, you bring in a whole new population. You'll have to fold into your people on the dole,
that was the
which you
thing
need
is
more.
the populations they conquered didn't get put on the dole. They just
Oh.
they basically just raided
Right.
the treasury of a neighboring
Yeah.
star, stripped it of everything valuable, and then ran it as a minimum viable planet. And
Well, and I think too that when you look at if we're talking about war on like an intergalactic scale, and depending on your timeline,
Interstellar.
I'm sorry, interstellar war, and depending on your timeline, you look at like I can't remember who was talking about it. There was some guy, somebody we had on the podcast a long time ago on Keystroke, who was talking about fleets, like space fleets, and how like really big they would actually be.
Oh, that was
Mal Cooper.
Oh, okay,
Mal
yeah,
Cooper.
Mal Cooper. He was.
I remember.
About, like,
I remember because that made an impression on me when he was talking about. Oh, you'll have millions of ships, and I'm like,
yeah.
no, you won't.
Well, depending on.
I mean, Mal
like,
comes from the perspective that resources won't be constrained. So I think that's the thing you have to, like, if you have a resource constrained system, then you have certain concerns. Or if you, I don't know, she buys in. That's just one of the things. Like, there'll be trillions of humans in Aeon 14, and you don't have to worry about resources. So
well, and I think yes, that's part of it too. But if you're like compounding, right, the growth, like if you have we just talk about like as a reference, like America, like the United States and their military complex, right? Like I don't know how many hundreds of ships and all of that, right? Well, if you extrapolate that to a planetary scale, how many more ships? I mean, we have, I don't know how many Navy ships we have. Let's just say
900
500. Okay, let's say 1,000, right? And then let's like extrapolate how much would the planet have if it was one planetary deal? They would have
900
10,000.
something.
Yeah, well, I'm just
No,
like,
really though, it would. You wouldn't. It doesn't extrapolate like that though, does it? Because like,
but why not?
well, look at China. How come China doesn't have like 5 times?
No,
the
I'm
military
just
we
using
have?
it as an example. Like if you're looking at like a galactic civilization that's
Because
spread
running
out.
11 aircraft carriers is not 11 times more expensive than running one.
I don't understand.
Well,
So-
there's economies of scale there as far
Yeah.
as what you're producing. and-
There's a scale to like, so now it isn't 11 times more expensive to operate 11 aircraft carriers than it is to operate one aircraft carrier. It's like 100 times more expensive.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
You know what I mean? Like one aircraft carrier requires one unrep ship and a crew to man that ship and this and that and everything. But 2 aircraft carriers doesn't require double everything. It requires quadruple everything because you have to have redundancy.
Yeah, okay.
So
No,
11
but see, I could
you
argue
know,
it's actually cheaper. I mean, it gets cheaper the more
It
you
gets
produce. And I mean, if you
cheaper-
have one of something, it's going to be pretty. It's
it
like
gets cheaper by percentage, but not by overall number. You know what I mean?
okay.
Like that's like your wife saying, "Hey, I bought this thing on sale. I saved us money." No, you didn't.
Yeah, you still spent
You
money.
spent
Yeah.
money.
Right.
You know.
Well, no, but I think that's where you get into like some of the loops we're stuck in now, where you have a industrial complex behind. We got to build things, and we keep building them because we then need to support people who build the things. But I think there's the mission of why, if you only need 900 ships to do a thing because of the capabilities they have, you don't necessarily need more of them to do that. But go ahead, Rick. I cut you off.
I'd say the problem I have with the idea that you could just make 1 million ships is every one of those ships you make to be a warship, you're not using that for something else that you could. You're not using it to ship in minerals. You're not using it to have a courier service that you could make money at. So even though the resources exist to make those ships, we have the resources today in our society to make a starship. It would be slow. It would go a fraction of the speed of light. it would take 100 years probably to get to Alpha Centauri, but we could build it. We have the technology. We don't do it because it would take a huge percentage of the world's domestic product to make. We're making a choice as to where we put our resources because we're making a choice to put them in other things. And the same thing would occur, especially in a civilization that was restricted to one solar system, like Mal's was at the time in AM14 before the starships, because you can make 1 million warships, but then you didn't make the stuff that would make your economy grow.
No,
That's why I don't think it'd be 1 million warships.
Well, you're right. I think we
Also-
have to like assume that people are rational. So that's where do you have a rational enemy or not? You know,
Right.
Plus, also you get into the fact that you got to crew those ships,
right?
and to crew those ships, you have to train people. So either you're gonna train 10 million people to man those ships over the course of 500 years, or you're gonna build a bunch of training facilities you're not gonna need in 6 months. So I mean, like again, it's economies of scale, right? So you're not gonna scale up to 1 million ships.
Unless they're all autonomous.
Unless they're all autonomous
AI
ships,
controlling.
and then then we're not talking about military sci-fi really, unless the AI are the characters.
Well, and if you're going to do something,
assuming
like that,
you need people,
you need like a Sparta society where everybody is part of the military industrial complex, and everybody's bought into the warrior religion that they have, and so the entire society's output goes into doing this thing.
Isn't that one of the no-nos though?
One of the
Sparta
what?
had Sparta had the. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Rick. Sparta's important.
I was going to say Sparta had the had to have a huge portion of their population be slaves in order to be able to.
Oh,
do
they
that.
weren't their population; they were other people's
Well, yeah,
population.
they had a huge slave workforce to grow
Most
their
societies,
food
yeah,
yeah.
most societies that have that sort of social economic output without having massive amounts of their population doing really menial labor have some kind of, they may not call them slaves, but they have some kind of worker class. Just like look at the Denmark and that area, they've got a massive amount of Islamic refugees who aren't citizens, so they don't have to be paid minimum wage. So yeah, they have the minimum wage of 25 euros an hour or whatever, except there are a bunch of Islamic people who are working for 7 euros an hour and are happy to do it. Kind of like migrant farmers, migrant pickers here in the United States come across the border and work at farms and ranches and whatnot, and they don't get paid minimum wage, they don't get benefits because they're off book.
Buy the strawberry.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing where I think you just got to think through that, where and I think you're right there. Like, okay, if you have a society that has not developed its base to be sustainable, they're basically on a death march, and you might have a charismatic leader who's leading them to that death march, but they've got one shot and they're going to go do it, and that could be a reason for war, right? That's a Hitler process. So,
yeah,
we're going to go do this thing.
The society based on one principle is like the planet based on one ecology, right? It's a big no-no. If you can do it, you just be very careful with how you do it, because every planet you run into can't be an ice planet or a desert planet or a forest planet or whatever, because planets are going to have weather systems unless you have a really good reason for it. Now, one of the things I like doing is taking things like that and doing them, but giving them like a really logical reason why.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to have a place like Dune or a place like Hoth, what you're going to have to come right out and say is, okay, yeah, the planet is icy or wasteland, but that's going to mean humans are only going to have a tiny portion of this planet where they can even live, and the rest of it's going to be uninhabitable.
Yeah, for sure. You're not going to have like,
or there's different ecosystems
cities
within. You've got a temperature band, and there's going to be different types of, like, think of the.
Well, I'm talking about if you do go with a planet with one ecology, one environment.
Well, that's what I mean. Even within, like,
that's going to mean
Antarctica has different areas that are slightly different within. We have 7 different words for snow or whatever. But I think the one note I want to make about, if you're going to make a culture that has like bought into this warlike concept and they're just going for broke, there's still always people that want to exploit that. Like Hitler was surrounded by people that thought they could kill the guy and control him or take over once he inevitably burned out.
Or get rich while he was in power.
Yeah, or get rich while he was in power. And so I think those are all things to think about to make that more believable. Like, there are always people that will think they can let something run long enough so they can exploit it, and it might get out of their control or not. But that's a way
But
you
it's
can
also
make.
temporary, though, right? Like, because if you extrapolate the rate at which Hitler's economy was growing, it was going to collapse. There was no situation where that war ended and Hitler was in charge of Europe. It was never going to end up that way. He didn't have the
one of the
people and he didn't have the resources to do it. He just thought he did.
And
one
he
of the
convinced
things
other
that I
people.
try to do to make life easier on myself, like as we're talking about this discussion and single biosphere planets and like single uh, government planets or whatever it is, I try to make it as simple as possible for myself, and therefore for the reader, because so I have one planet or one group of people in the weaponized series that I'm working on that is like the monolithic society, right? Where it's one planet and they're following this guy. And I developed that leadership out of a really brutal civil war. And the whole concept behind this guy's control of the planet is that he is ensuring that nobody else takes advantage of the planet, which there were a lot of people trying to do. And kind of like in it's kind of a mix of like uh, Russian bureaucracy or the oligarch type deal, where there's a whole bunch of oligarchs that really don't care about politics or anything like that. They just care about
Oh
lining their
no, Josh,
pockets.
you're writing an analogy for the Russian-Ukraine war.
Well, no,
Sorry, I'm joking.
I'm
That's a joke.
I'm combining elements of that and like North Korea, where you've got a kind of a really charismatic, almost godlike figure who has kind of brought the country out of ash. And I'm sure that there are pockets of people that don't agree with him, but there's nothing they can do about it. And the people that are getting rich because of his policies want to keep getting rich on his policies, so they're supporting him, kind of like, I hesitate to say deep state, but kind of that background, kind of
Why do you
behind the
hesitate? It's the
scenes.
truth.
Well, I know, but it's just one of those meme words that a lot of people like to use. But I don't like to do that for everything. I like you said, it kind of gets boring to have one planet that's just focused on one thing. But like I said, for simplicity's sake, I kind of, in my mind anyway, relate planetary governments to like nation countries here on Earth, like Germany is, or France or whatever. And that way it helps me kind of mentally get over the block of or even paint myself into a corner of, if this civilization is interstellar and there's a planet, let's just say a planet like Earth now somewhere else, with a whole bunch of different countries and a whole bunch of different policies and a whole bunch of different people, like how does that play out on an intergalactic scale, or I'm sorry, interstellar scale? um, but it that can very easily get really complicated really quickly, and if it doesn't serve the story, then it doesn't matter.
I mean, it's
um,
another argument for fewer, like having that resource constraint, because like when you add more people, that's where you add complexity, right? Because like
mhm.
that's where more people is more politics. And so if you have fewer people, or a planet, like technology allows people to control, like they don't have to be spread across the planet. They could be in, I mean, I don't, however you explain it, I think that's what makes it more realistic, to have a realistic, like this planet only has 4 major population centers. And like, it's not that it's a
Yes.
monoculture, it's just that people haven't been here long enough to, or maybe they don't want to spread out, whatever, how you choose to do that.
I did
One
that with
thing
that. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
is that one thing I do in some of my books that are closer in time to the present, uh, when they get into a conflict with a different interstellar culture, one thing that inevitably happens is that not everybody on Earth takes the same side. I mean, we wind up having to fight like the Russians or the Chinese or the French or somebody, because they have their own plan that they want to use to make to take advantage of the fact that there's an interstellar war going on. So if you're dealing with 2 planets that both have multiple nations on, that's going to make an incredibly complicated story, which I'm not sure a lot of people have the patience or the knowledge to write.
Yeah, I mean, you get into a really difficult kind of ring around the rosy with like interstellar, but also interplanetary politics, and
Right.
it could get very, very
And
hairy.
this is all kind
Well,
of
I did-
background. Like we're not writing the interstellar political thriller, and even I shouldn't say thriller, like the interstellar politics podcast, because even in a
part of
thriller,
military sci-fi though is the
well, yeah, but
politics
people
that leads
come
to the
to
war.
I think people come to military SF like they want a human story in the midst of a conflict, and the reasons for the conflict should just make sense. They don't have to be completely, you're not got to do hours of boardroom meetings and
I
that
don't.
well, that just
I
becomes
mean, the
like one,
president of the alliance is one of the characters in the book, as is
yeah.
a senator, and
Well,
I do
but
get
that
into that. I mean, I
but
do
that
get
serves a
into the
purpose
politics.
though, because that allows the reader to understand the bigger why. But you're not spending 20,000 words on that.
No, probably not. Probably like 4,000 or
Just
5,000.
4,000.
But I mean, I like that. I like that. One of the things I love about Weber's books, especially the first 8, were the breadth of characters and the world building and the explanation of like why weren't they doing the things that they were doing,
Mhm.
and that spawned from my interest in that spawned from that idiot who ran the Iraq War, the first one, who was all like, we're going to win this war with the fewest people possible. And I was like, why? When in history was that a good idea? We have overwhelming forces. Let's just.
Are you talking? Yeah, that would be the second one, not the first one.
Yeah, the second
Second
one,
second
Rumsfeld,
one's
because they
Rumsfeld,
Ru-
yeah.
fired
Rumsfeld, yeah.
when Shinseki said how many people he thought it was actually going to take to occupy Iraq.
Yeah.
Rumsfeld fired him.
And I feel like that's the crux of every bad military decision in history is some idiot in a suit or a robe behind the Roman legions going, well, we could send all 5,000 of you, but I think 100 will do. Go kill all the Germans in Germania.
They'll greet us as victors.
Right.
It'll be great. We'll bring democracy. I still think.
Well, I think you're right though about the fact that people don't generally read military science fiction for the politics of it. They want some flavor of politics, but like a seasoning that shouldn't be one of the main ingredients for them. But I mean, I feel like the mental gymnastics of why different planets or systems would fight an interstellar war is a good thing that an author can do before they write the book. Not that they're going to put all this in the book, but to give them a feel for the world they're building and why people do what they do. And you can introduce some of it and keep the rest, 90, like rest of the iceberg under the water. But I feel like it is a good exercise for you to do before you write military science fiction. And if you're reading it, maybe think about, if you're into history at all, think about like historical parallels to what you're reading.
And if you want to write military sci-fi and you're not into history, you really should be.
Yes. But yeah, I was just say, as a writer, if you're listening to this and you want to write military science fiction, just remember you don't have to include all the stuff we're talking about as exposition in your novel. This is stuff that you do so that you know why everybody's fighting each other,
Right.
and you can make it sound, make it have some verisimilitude.
You don't even have to have it a lockdown. You just have to have a general idea.
Yeah.
Because a
Yeah.
lot of my political system for Grimm's War evolved as I was writing it. I had the basic idea, I had the basic premise and everything, but it evolved. Now I'm occasionally a visitor on Reddit, our sci-fi, our mill sci-fi, I think, for writing. Our writing mill sci-fi, something like that. Anyways, and every once in a while I'll see a question in the headline, and I'll start answering before I've even read the post, right? Because the headline has the question. And then I'll delete it because I'll read the post and I'm like, oh, this guy's not even there yet, right? It's like yesterday it was about like, I've created these 2 societies and every person in this society has superpowers, but this is somehow supposed to be like a military sci-fi. But he's talking about the Nova Corps and the Kree and things like that. And I'm just like, dude, you're not there yet. You're still grabbing that low-hanging fruit. You're still grabbing the stuff off the tree that you can reach. You need to get a ladder and go up higher. Because that stuff that comes to you when you first start writing, it can be good. It can be good. I'm not saying it's not good. It can be good. But usually the thing that you get 3 or 4 levels up is the thing that you want. And usually you don't get that until you're already writing and creating and in that creative, artist mode and not engineer mode where you're trying to solve problems. But
I
having
mean,
that.
what's
ahead.
crazy about that is that that's even true to, like, it's true of beginning writers, but it's also like I do it all the time. Like I get like with Weaponized, I got all the way through the first draft and realized that I could do something different. But then I'm always thinking about the thing about the thing that really, it doesn't bug me because I don't spend a lot of time reading these books, but the thing that really trips me up, that I really am cognizant about making sure that my books have, is having a lot of, and I've said it before, depth, instead of just taking the first idea and running with it. What does that idea mean for all these 6 other ideas? And can you interweave some of the aspects of different things together? And, sometimes even getting through to the end of the book, you don't even realize everything that you have. And then you can go back and kind of work technology or how they do things, all of that stuff in after. And I think, I said for the sake of simplicity, I relate world to planetary nation governments, but I think a lot of a lot just want to just write, British versus French or whatever it is, right? And just leave it at that without really having any um real depth, like we're talking about here. Like, what is the reason? Like, what's the conflict about? Is it a long-standing thing? Like, there,
Well, you
even
can
just
do
the
you can do both. You mean it's possible to write allegories for things like the British versus the French or World War II in space, and
for sure,
still make a thing that makes sense. Like, for instance, Drop Trooper books 1 through 4 are very obviously, for anybody who was paying attention, an allegory to the war in the Pacific in World War II. But you know, to make it work that way, I had to, come up with a world that could be built with a reason why these people were the way they were. And also, I didn't attempt to use the war in Europe at the same time. Although we both know a writer who has done a space World War II that did the war in Europe and the war in Asia at the same time.
Who?
true.
Ralph Kern did that.
Mhm.
Oh, I don't know him.
He wrote the Great War series, which is he came out and said it's World War II in space. So he has 2 different enemies facing like 3 or 4 allied nations.
Oh, that's cool. I'll have to read that. And if you're a writer and you're like listening to this, or you're an author, or you're wanting to be an author and you're listening to some of this and you're like, I don't understand what they're saying or what they're meaning, that's okay. A lot of what we've touched today is what I call 201. And writing is a lot like a lot of things, like math. It's line upon line, right? You got to learn the 101 stuff before you get the 201, because you don't know what you don't know. So if you're a beginning writer, this is good information, but it probably won't help you until you've written a few 100,000 words. And then it will kick in and you'll be like, oh, that's what they were talking about. This happens to me all the time. That's why writing classes are all identical in every college, in every online course across the universe, is because they can only teach the very basic 101 stuff. They can't get into the depths of themes and reverse themes and allegories and all that stuff. That's all much later on.
Well, this will hopefully save you a little bit of time when you write those 100,000 words and then realize, like, oh crap, I didn't think about this. But I think it's also, it's just important to remember, like we were talking about, like, why are people coming to your story? What do they want? They might not be there to get into these depths of things, but knowing this in your mind will really help make decisions and how the story could be, more thrilling and more effective. And if you're going to write a longer series, you definitely need to have thought about these things, because it's very hard to maintain a series of battles or a series of conflicts if you haven't thought about the greater, like, why are they even in this conflict? I mean, I always love to have, like, the private who doesn't, knows Jack, and is complaining to the lieutenant who maybe knows a little bit of Jack, and then the lieutenant
Right.
goes to, complains to the company commander, who's, probably tired and doesn't care, and like, I care about my sector, shut up and go do your job. But these are all things you can kind of layer if you've been in the military. It's always one thing to then take that, and they could all be watching a news report that shows it from the media perspective, which could be totally different than what they see on the ground. But the thrilling thing the reader came to read about is the actual, like, attacking an objective, which is totally different than what. So you can layer all these things and then over time, if you have something bigger you want to say, or how you want to come out of this overall conflict, those are all pieces you can play with, and having the background makes that easier, I think. So I don't know, I thought this has actually been a great conversation. We probably are in a place where we should tie it up, but
And on that bombshell, right?
I know you give me some good things to hit back with.
I love the rambling podcasts, man.
I know.
I love those ones.
Well, I'm in plenty of, like, one of the things for me, especially in writers groups, like when I'll bring, say, a military science fiction story, which is pretty niche. I make the joke about being niche, but you talk, even among SF writers, they'll read it and be like, I don't know why they have guns. Like, people don't need guns in the future. And like, well,
because they're cool, man.
They're humans, and we didn't even get into, like, maybe they won't be guns. Maybe there'll be radiation emitters on your forehead or something. I don't know. But, some way to get what you want.
Nobody wants to read that.
You don't want to read
us in space is what they want.
Pretty much.
Right now, for now, anyways. For now, it could change in 20 years.
I mean, I read one that had
20 years ago.
Basically a dirty bomb that was pretty terrifying the way the guy had described it. And it was just a dirty bomb, but it wrecked a civilian population, and that was sad. So anyway, any other last thoughts anybody wants to tie on before we close out?
Want to be a writer, you have to write every day. That's just, I know that's the stupidest, silliest, most simple advice you could possibly hear, but the number of people I hear refuting that online is just beyond ridiculous. So if you're watching this and you want to be a writer, just make sure you're writing every day.
That is the hardest and best advice. Go ahead.
My thought would be, apropos to this episode, remember that your job as a writer is not to make the most believable scenario that would stand up to the War College and your doctoral dissertation. Your job is to entertain the reader.
Yes.
And they want to read about, space combat or Marines on the ground, and they want you to come up with a good reason why they're there. It's just good enough that they can not think about it while they're reading the book.
I think MIL sci-fi is, I'm sure there's a lot of genres that fall into this, but it's definitely a genre that leads really heavily into the rule of cool, regardless of technicalities or limitations or logistics or anything like that. It's the rule of cool. And as long as you can just a little bit, make it believable or understandable in the thing that you're doing, then the rule of cool rules all. I mean, it's key.
Which is, if it's cool, it rules. So
That's
now
true.
pretty much you can get away with just about anything as long as it's cool and people like to keep reading it. But if you pile on too many things that don't make any sense, that's where people are like, this isn't cool anymore. I have to think about it.
If you have something cool you want to share with us, please hit us up on our Discord. That should be in the show notes. And, contact us individually. Let us know.
Or let me give you Jeff's private phone number and you can
do
call
that.
him.
Do that.
It's on my card.
Right now.
I hand it out all the time. Nobody
Call
ever
Jeff
calls
and
me.
tell him that he was not writing allegories for current political events.
I really wasn't. That's my favorite review ever. Like, dude, I wrote this 2 years before they invaded. How could I? I'm not a fortune teller.
And also, I had somebody tell me that the war in Drop Trooper was supposed to be an allegory for the Middle East. I'm like, it's World War II in the Pacific. How can you not see that? I even mentioned island hopping.
It's because every war is the same.
War never changes.
Because every war is the
I
same.
like how we brought that back. I like
War
how we
never
brought it back.
changes.
That's a
Good job,
callback.
James.
All right. All right. Thank you. Well, on that note, we'll talk to you next time. Go watch Fallout. Later.
Load up, troopers on a hit and jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.